EVO. At 5:04 p.m. on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge carried rush hour traffic like it had every weekday evening for 4 decades. Christmas shoppers heading home with packages, workers finishing their shifts, families traveling to holiday gatherings just across the river. In car after car, conversations flowed, dinner plans, children's homework, weekend hopes. Ordinary moments suspended 150 feet above the Ohio River, held aloft by steel cables in the faith that bridges built to last would keep their promise. But faith, like steel, can fracture in an instant. At exactly 5:04 p.m. and 47 seconds, I-bar 330 finally surrendered to a crack that had been growing for months. 2.5 inches of microscopic failure became catastrophic collapse. The bridge's northern span twisted, buckled, and plunged into the black water below, taking 46 souls with it in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The Mothman's vigil was over. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Wings of Prophecy, Part 2. If you've been haunted by Episode 1, make sure you're subscribed to The Devil Within. Our back catalog has more investigations into the darkness that lives at the edge of human understanding. Leave us a review and help others discover these stories that examine how folklore and tragedy interweave in the American experience. Today, we follow the Mothman legend to its devastating conclusion, exploring the final sightings before Point Pleasant's darkest hour, and confronting the terrible question that still echoes through the Ohio River Valley. Can prophecy exist without hope of prevention? Chapter 4. The Final Witnesses. The last confirmed Mothman sighting came just 3 days before the bridge collapsed. Connie Carpenter was driving home from her job at the telephone company on December 11, 1967, when she saw the creature perched on a billboard just outside Point Pleasant city limits. Now, unlike the previous witnesses who had stumbled upon the beast in darkness, Connie encountered it in broad freaking daylight, and what she saw challenged every assumption the growing legion of believers and skeptics had formed about Point Pleasant's winged harbinger. The creature appeared smaller in daylight. That's what she would later tell investigators. Still massive, still wrong in ways that defied natural explanation, but somehow diminished. Its gray flesh looked weathered, almost translucent in the winter sun. And those famous burning red eyes seemed dimmer, as if whatever internal fire had powered them for 13 months was finally beginning to fade. But it was the creature's posture that unnerved Connie the most. It wasn't the aggressive, predatory stance described by earlier witnesses. Instead, it sat hunched forward on the billboard's edge, its enormous wings folded tight against its body, looking for all the world like a mourner at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. It looked sad, she would tell Mary Heyer in one of the reporter's final interviews before the tragedy. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but there was something heartbroken about the way it sat there, like it knew something terrible was coming and couldn't do anything to stop it. By December of 1967, Point Pleasant had transformed into something unrecognizable from the quiet river town it had been just 13 months earlier. The initial trickle of curious visitors had become a flood of thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and reporters from across the country. The Mothman had become a cottage industry, with local businesses capitalizing on the legend, even as longtime residents grew increasingly resentful of the attention. The town was fracturing along lines that went deeper than belief versus skepticism. There were those who embraced the notoriety, shopkeepers selling Mothman t-shirts and postcards, tour guides leading expeditions out to the dynamite plant, enterprising locals charging admission to hear their personal encounter stories. And then there were those who wanted their community back, who resented seeing their home reduced to a punchline in late-night television monologues. Mary Hyre had become the unofficial chronicler of Point Pleasant's transformation, filing regular updates for the Athens Messenger and increasingly national publications. Her hotel room at the Low had become an informal headquarters for Mothman research, filled with maps marking sighting locations, interviews with witnesses, and an ever-growing collection of theories about what the creature might actually represent. But as winter settled over the Ohio River Valley, Hyre noticed a troubling pattern in her data. The sightings were becoming less frequent, yes, but they were also changing in character. The creature that had once seemed almost playfully elusive, appearing just long enough to be seen before vanishing into the darkness, now it lingered in plain sight, as if it had abandoned any pretense of hiding. More disturbing were the dreams. Throughout December, residents across Point Pleasant reported remarkably similar nightmares. Visions of water rushing through broken steel, of Christmas packages floating in black currents, of familiar faces disappearing beneath the surface of the Ohio River. These dreams were so vivid, so consistent across dozens of unrelated individuals, that some began to wonder if the Mothman's influence extended beyond physical sightings and into the realm of collective unconscious. Dr. Robert Bradley, the veterinarian who had examined Newell Partridge's mutilated dog, found himself documenting increasingly strange animal behavior throughout Mason County. Domestic animals refused to cross the Silver Bridge, even in cars. Wild birds avoided the area entirely. Their usual migration patterns altered to give Point Pleasant a wide berth. Even the river itself seemed different. Fishermen reported strange currents or unusual water temperatures, and an absence of the fish that had populated those waters for generations. "It's like nature knows something we don't," Bradley confided to Mary Hyre over coffee at the diner that had become her second office. "Animals have instincts that we've forgotten," he said. "Maybe we should be listening to them." But perhaps the most unsettling development was the change in the original witnesses themselves. Roger and Linda Scarberry, once eager to share their story, had grown withdrawn and haunted. Steve and Mary Millette rarely ventured out after dark. Newell Partridge had closed his barbershop and was making plans to move his family to Ohio, away from whatever shadow had settled over their town. "We started something we can't stop," Linda Scarberry said to Mary during their final interview. "That thing didn't just show itself to us, it marked us, and now it's marking the whole town." On December 14th, just one day before the collapse, the Mothman made its penultimate appearance to perhaps its most credible witness yet, Sheriff George Johnson, a man whose skepticism about the creature had been public and unwavering since those first reports in November. Sheriff Johnson was driving across the Silver Bridge at approximately 11 p.m. when he saw the creature perched on the northern tower, its massive form silhouetted against the stars. For nearly 5 minutes, man and beast regarded each other across the span. The lawman who had spent months dismissing the sightings as mass hysteria, and the harbinger that had patiently waited for this moment of recognition. "I don't know what I saw," Johnson would tell investigators later, his voice hollow with the weight of a worldview shattered. "But I know it was looking right at me. And in those eyes, in those eyes I saw everything that was about to happen." Now, the sheriff never filed an official report about his encounter, and by the time he might have found the courage to do so, Point Pleasant had much bigger problems than a creature with wings. The vigil was almost over. Chapter 5. The Weight of Steel and Prophecy. The Silver Bridge had been dying for longer than anyone realized. In the winter of 1967, as Point Pleasant grappled with winged harbingers and impossible sightings, a more prosaic but far deadlier threat was growing in the bridge's vital infrastructure. IBAR 330, a crucial component of the suspension system's northern anchor, had developed a fatigue crack that measured just 0.1 inches when it first appeared sometime in late 1966. The crack was invisible to routine inspections, hidden within the eyebar's internal structure like a cancer growing in the darkness. Each day, as thousands of vehicles crossed the span, the crack grew incrementally. Stress cycles accumulating, metal fatigue spreading, the bridge's structural integrity compromised by microscopic degrees. Federal Bridge Inspector Harold Morrison had walked the Silver Bridge's length dozens of times over the past 5 years, checking cables, examining connections, testing the massive pins that held the suspension system together. His reports consistently rated the bridge as safe for normal traffic loads. What Morrison couldn't see, what no one could see without sophisticated equipment that wouldn't be developed for another decade, was that the bridge was committing suicide, one stress cycle at a time. By December 15, 1967, the crack in eyebar 330 had grown to 2.5 inches, still invisible, still undetectable by the inspection methods of the era, but now representing a catastrophic failure point that would require only the slightest additional stress to trigger complete collapse. And that additional stress would arrive at 5:04 p.m. in the form of rush hour traffic. Mary Heyer had spent the morning of December 15th interviewing witnesses for what she intended to be her final article about the Mothman phenomenon. The story had run its course, she felt. The sightings had dwindled, the initial excitement had faded into routine, and Point Pleasant was slowly returning to something resembling normal life. She had lunch with Sheriff Johnson, who remained deeply shaken by his encounter on the bridge from the previous night. This is the man who had once dismissed the creature as mass hysteria, who was now speaking in whispers about prophetic dreams and the weight of terrible knowledge. "Mary," he said, pushing his untouched sandwich around on his plate, "what if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the thing wasn't just some random monster, but something trying to tell us something that we weren't smart enough to understand?" Mary looked at him. Tell us what, George?" The sheriff stared out the diner window toward the Silver Bridge, visible in the distance like a thread connecting two worlds. "Well, that we're living on borrowed time. That everything we think is permanent, our bridge, our town, our lives, it's all just one bad day from falling apart." At 4:30 p.m., Mary was in her hotel room, packing her bags and preparing to return to Athens. Her Mothman investigation was complete, she decided. Whatever the creature had been, hallucination, hoax, or genuine cryptid, it belonged to Point Pleasant's past now. The town would heal from the strange obsession that had gripped it for 13 months, and life would continue with the reliable rhythm it had maintained for generations. She paused in her packing to look out her window at the Silver Bridge. Rush hour traffic was building, a steady stream of headlights flowing across the span as workers headed home for the weekend. Christmas was just 10 days away, and the bridge was carrying more than its usual load. Shoppers returning from Gallipolis, families returning for holiday visits, the normal acceleration of life that preceded that yearly celebration of peace and goodwill. Among that traffic, moving with the patient rhythm of everyday life, were 46 people who had less than 34 minutes to live. Charlene Wood was driving home from her Christmas shopping expedition, her backseat filled with presents for her 3 kids. She'd found the perfect doll for her youngest daughter, Sarah, after searching for 3 different stores. The 7-year-old had been asking for it since October, and Charlene couldn't wait to see the expression on her face Christmas morning. James Bodges had just finished his shift at the chemical plant and was looking forward to a quiet weekend. His wife was making pot roast, his favorite, and they were planning to drive around town that evening to look at Christmas decorations. At 62 years old, he'd begun to appreciate these simple pleasures more than he had in his younger years. Melvin Lewis was carpooling with 2 co-workers, discussing their company's Christmas bonus and making plans for New Year's Eve. At 28, Lewis felt like his life was finally falling into place. Steady job, loving wife, and a baby on the way. He'd just gotten word that afternoon that his wife's pregnancy was progressing perfectly. None of these people noticed the hairline crack spreading through I-bar 330, invisible, inexorable. None of them felt the bridge's subtle vibrations change as the steel began its final moments of resistance. None of them saw the Mothman either, if indeed it was watching from somewhere in the December sky, as it bore witness to the culmination of 13 months of impossible vigil. At exactly 5:04 and 46 seconds, I-bar 330 surrendered to forces it could no longer contain. The failure was instantaneous and catastrophic. The northern span of the Silver Bridge twisted, buckled, and collapsed into the Ohio River in less than 60 seconds, taking with it 37 vehicles and 46 people. The sound, a grinding shriek of tortured steel, followed by the massive splash of the bridge's death, could be heard for miles. Mary Heyer was still at her hotel when it happened. One moment she was watching the familiar rhythm of traffic crossing the bridge. The next, she was staring at empty sky above churning black water, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had actually witnessed. The Mothman's prophecy was complete. Chapter 6. The Silence That Followed. In the hours after the collapse, Point Pleasant transformed from a community into a disaster zone. Emergency responders arrived from across 3 states, their searchlights cutting through the December darkness as divers plunged into the frigid Ohio River, searching for survivors in the twisted wreckage of steel and concrete that had once been the Silver Bridge. 18 people were pulled from the water alive, many suffering from hypothermia and severe injuries. 28 bodies were recovered in the immediate aftermath. The final victim wouldn't be found until the following summer, when the river finally released its hold on what remained of the bridge's deadly embrace. Mary Heyer remained in Point Pleasant, her planned departure forgotten as she documented the aftermath of the tragedy that she had witnessed. Her hotel room, once filled with Mothman research, now became a makeshift newsroom as reporters from across the nation descended on the devastated community. The creature that had brought Point Pleasant its first taste of national attention was forgotten in the face of very real, very human suffering. But among the survivors and the families of the victims, whispered conversations began to emerge in the days following the collapse. Stories of dreams, premonitions, of warnings unheeded, of a winged creature that had tried, in its alien way, to prepare them for what it knew was coming. Connie Carpenter, who had seen the Mothman's final vigil just days before the disaster, found herself haunted not by nightmares, but by a single, terrible question. Had the creature's mournful posture been an expression of sorrow for what it knew was inevitable, or had it been grieving for a community that wouldn't listen to the only warning that it knew how to give? Sheriff George Johnson, whose skepticism had crumbled during his encounter on the bridge, spent the weeks after the collapse interviewing other witnesses, trying to piece together a pattern that somehow might explain the unexplainable. What he discovered was a timeline that suggested that the Mothman's appearances had intensified as the bridge's structural integrity weakened, as if the creature had been drawn by the approaching disaster like a moth to flame. Maybe, Johnson told Mary in one of their final conversations before she ultimately left Point Pleasant, maybe we've been thinking about the prophecy all wrong, he said. Maybe it's not about predicting the future. Maybe it's about recognizing the present for what it really is, that the bridge was failing long before it fell. The signs were there in the steel, in the stress, in the engineering reports nobody wanted to read too carefully. Maybe the Mothman didn't see the future. Maybe it just saw the truth that we were too comfortable to notice. The investigation into the bridge collapse would eventually conclude that the disaster was caused by a single point of failure. I-bar 330's fatigue crack had grown to critical size over months or possibly years, making collapse inevitable once traffic loads exceeded the compromised structure's capacity. It was a tragedy rooted in aging infrastructure, insufficient inspection protocols, and the simple passage of time wearing down what had once seemed permanent. But the families who lost loved ones in those black waters of the Ohio River were left with questions that engineering reports couldn't answer. Why had their dreams been filled with visions of disaster in the weeks before it happened? Why had animals avoided the bridge in its final days? And why had a creature with burning red eyes chosen to watch over their community during the 13 months when death was growing in the steel above their heads? The Mothman was never seen again after the bridge collapsed. Its vigil was complete. Its purpose, whatever purpose that might have been, was fulfilled. Point Pleasant slowly began to rebuild both its infrastructure and its sense of identity. The new bridge, opened in 1969, incorporated lessons learned from the disaster: modern inspection techniques, redundant safety systems, and steel that wouldn't fail the way IBAR 330 had failed. But the legend endured. The Mothman had become part of Point Pleasant's identity in ways that transcended mere folklore. It represented the community's encounter with mystery, their brush with forces beyond understanding, and their survival of tragedy that might have destroyed a less resilient place. Years later, when researchers studied the bridge collapse and its aftermath, they would note how a community's folklore had evolved to process trauma, how the inexplicable creature had provided a framework for understanding disaster that cold engineering facts couldn't. The Mothman wasn't just Point Pleasant's monster. It was their prophet, it was their warning system, and ultimately, their way of making meaning from meaningless loss. So, in the end, perhaps the most profound mystery of the Mothman isn't whether it existed, but what it represented in the human psyche. Our deep need to find pattern in chaos, to find meaning in tragedy, and hope in the darkness that surrounds us. Point Pleasant's winged harbinger gave the community something that engineering reports and insurance settlements never could: the possibility that their suffering had purpose, that their loss had been witnessed, and that somewhere in that realm between the natural and the supernatural, something had cared enough to keep vigil over their final days of innocence. The truth about prophecy may be simpler and more terrible than we imagine. It's not about seeing the future, but about recognizing the present moment for exactly what it is. And sometimes what it is just the end of everything that we always thought we could depend on. Thanks for listening. Next week on The Devil Within, we journey to a forgotten corner of the Austrian countryside, where the cobblestones still echo with screams from 1823. In the village of St. Georgen, behind shuttered windows and whispered prayers, residents live with the knowledge that some evils refuse to stay buried. Join us as we investigate the case of Anna Eklund, a possession so violent and so enduring that it transformed an entire community's understanding of faith, evil, and the thin boundaries between salvation and damnation. We'll explore how one young woman's torment became a village's curse, how the rituals meant to cast out darkness may have invited something far worse to take residence, and why, more than 200 years later, the locals still refuse to speak her name after sunset. Until then, remember, in the shadows between devotion and despair, some prayers are answered in ways we never intended to ask. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.